Bridget has been in her role as the community curator for Salisbury Museum for just over a year now. And prior to that, Bridget was the project curator for Salisbury Museum's major redevelopment project funded by National Lottery Heritage Fund. And part of that was to see the opening of 3 new galleries to the public in 2024. And in 2023, Bridget set up a Black History interpretation group. And the aim of that was to support the museum in how to interpret narratives that explore Black history and heritage within the new Salisbury galleries. So Bridget will be sharing insights into that, about setting up the group, what the group explored, and also the outcomes and lessons learned from the project. So I will hand over to Bridget at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I hope everyone can see the screen. So, as Hannah said, I was a project curator for the museum's major redevelopment project called Pass Forward Salisbury Museum for Future Generations. In July 2024, we opened 3 new galleries to the public: the Devonish Bradshaw Salisbury Gallery, Ceramics Gallery, and Natural History Gallery. So, why the need for a Black History group? The new Salisbury Gallery covers the period from 1220 up to the present day, over 3 interconnecting chronological rooms. The middle room is entitled Evolving City and covers the period 1540 until 1837. In this room, we wanted to explore both the story of early Black presence in the area and also the local narrative around slavery. I was very aware that this was not my history to tell. The whole development of our new galleries was underpinned by a programme of community collaboration and co-curation. So it was an obvious step to take to reach out to people with Black heritage to help to tell this narrative. I was also aware of best practice in the sector and spoke to a number of museums that have tackled similar projects, including the National Museum Wales, Royal Albert Memorial Museum and Art Gallery in Exeter, and Bristol Museum and Art Gallery. I gained valuable learning from their work that I was able to feed back into the museum project. I firstly came up with a list of objectives for the project. I had to understand where the museum wanted to get to before planning how to get there. So this is a list of objectives. For the new Salisbury Gallery to tell the story of Salisbury and South Wiltshire slavery links in a sensitive and accurate way. For the new Salisbury Gallery to tell the story of early Black presence as a separate story to that of slavery. For Black voices to be included in the narrative, and for Black people to have shaped and influenced the story. For Black people and audiences from other protected characteristics to see their history represented in the new Salisbury Gallery, and to feel that Salisbury Museum is relevant to their lives. For Salisbury Museum staff to learn from this work and have the confidence and aspiration to carry out further decolonial work. I realised there was a lot of work to do before I was in a position to set up the Black History Interpretation Group. Before doing this, I needed to understand our collection better and the objects and themes that we would want to explore with the group. So the museum hosted a Leicester University placement, and MA student Charles Michael led on the research to uncover Salisbury and South Wiltshire slavery links. This utilised the UCL Legacies of British Slavery database to look up local landowners and wealthy family names. The museum then engaged a local historian, Ruth Newman, to do further research on the local slavery and anti-slavery story. She accessed local newspaper reports through the British Newspaper Archive, and these were extremely useful. Ruth Newman also investigated early Black presence in Salisbury and South Wiltshire, building on the work carried out by Wiltshire and Swindon History Centre. Museum staff then used our collections database to search for collections that were relevant to the narrative. Setting up the Black History Interpretation Group. So after understanding the collections and stories we wanted to explore better, I turned to the issue of recruiting the participants for the Black History Interpretation Group. I wanted to find individuals from a Black or mixed heritage who had an interest and knowledge of Black history, the transatlantic slave trade, and decolonisation. The museum had few connections to people that might be interested in taking part in this group, so I pretty much started from scratch. I approached 2 lecturers from the nearest university, Winchester University, who taught courses covering decolonial perspectives. They were Professor Oluteru, senior lecturer in the Department of Performing Arts at Winchester University, who also happened to be a Salisbury resident, Professor Robert Beckford, director of the New Institute of Climate and Social Justice. I also approached Sonia Carr, chair of the Wiltshire Race Equality Council. I'd already had some contact with Sonia through a previous project. And Louisa Adjoa Parker, writer, poet, trainer, and EDI consultant, who has done a lot of work in museums around decolonisation and telling sensitive stories. I also did a presentation on the project to the Wiltshire Council Staff Forum and their BAME group, their terminology, not mine. And one participant, Charlotte Nije, came forward from this. I then had one-to-one conversations with each person to ensure that participants understood the parameters of the project and had the right skills and interests for the group. So in total, I recruited 5 individuals from a Black history or mixed heritage to take part. Running the Black History Interpretation Group. So researching our collections had identified 3 main themes to explore within the sessions. Objects that were byproducts of slavery, linked to sugar, coffee, tobacco, snuff and cotton. Objects linked to the Beckfords of Fonthill Estate, a Wiltshire family that benefited financially from the transatlantic slave trade. And 2 locally made mayoral chairs of 1585 and 1622, with depictions of Black women carved onto them. These objects became the basis for 3 sessions with the group on each of the 3 themes. The original intention was for the Black History Interpretation Group to meet in person as a group, which would have made it easier to investigate the actual objects. However, as the participants all worked, it was easier to find the time to meet online. The sessions ran on consecutive weeks, so that we kept up a sense of momentum. Sessions were 1.5 hours long. 2 sessions were in the evening, and 1 session was during the day. Participants were paid £75 session for their expertise and time, and all sessions were recorded and transcribed. We knew that many of the objects that we had in the museum that reflected Georgian luxury, objects linked to sugar, coffee, tobacco, snuff and cotton, were the byproducts of the slavery. So in the first session within the Black History Interpretation Group, we examined these objects. This slide shows some examples: a snuff box, teapot, sugar nippers and pipe. These are some of the responses that the group had to these objects. When I look at the objects, I see the pain and suffering of enslaved people, The Racial Terror of Plantation Slavery. That was Robert Beckford. If you didn't know the history, they could be completely inoffensive pretty objects. Louisa Adjoa Parker. The objects depict the hidden voice, and I cry. I cry because those objects that mean repression. They have taken away the voice of my community, and that person wishes to be anonymous. There was an objectification of the enslaved person. We would have been products, objects for trade. Yet we see the beautiful, fantastic music enslaved people made. So you have stripped our identity, stripped us of our culture, but we will reinvent ourselves. So, and that was Olu sorry. So you can see the level of emotion and empathy that the group had to the objects. One of their main messages was to contextualize the objects within the labeling. How did these objects directly relate to the transatlantic slave trade and enslaved people? It was the idea of the group to display ceramics made by Josiah Wedgwood. They were fascinated by the fact that Wedgwood manufactured teapots and sugar bowls on a huge scale, and it was Britain's taste for sugar that drove the demand for enslaved labor in the Americas. Yet Wedgwood also abstained from sugar and campaigned for the abolition of the trade in enslaved African people. Our research uncovered that numerous Wiltshire families benefited financially from slavery, the most prominent being the Beckfords of Fonthill Estate. When Alderman Beckford died in 1770, his 9-year-old son, William, inherited Jamaican sugar plantations and hundreds of enslaved Africans. Robert Beckford, one of the Black History Interpretation Group participants, is a Black descendant of the Beckfords of Fonthill Estate. This wasn't just luck that I had him as a participant. He had previously featured in a BBC documentary called Britain's Slave Trade, in which he explored this link, which I did know about when I reached out to him. He decided to change his surname, writing Beckford with a line drawn through it, to show his resistance to his enslaved heritage. This is a quote from Robert Beckford from one of our group sessions that is also features in the new gallery. The most colonial thing about us are these badges of ownership, our names. In April 2024, I decided to write my name with a strike through to show its controversy. It is my name, but also it isn't. This is because my ancestors had a history in Africa before they were enslaved by the British in the West Indies. In our third session, we looked at these locally made mayoral chairs of 1585 and 1622. They have been on display in the old Salisbury Gallery since the 1980s, with absolutely no reference to the inclusion of a carving of two semi-naked Black women on the top of the chair. Because of their early date, they also gave us the opportunity to explore early Black presence in the area. In the gallery, we explore the diverging opinions that the group had to these chairs. And these are two of the responses. Charlotte Nijay said, "The chair to me links more to Africa. Their chairs were designed for kings. How people demonstrate their love to their loved ones is by making sure their image is carved on their chair. My grandfather was a king. He had much respect for my mother, and so an image of my mum is carved into his chair." Whereas Robert Beckford said, "While I like the constructive reading, my gut feeling is that it is hard to redeem it. In 1585, the dawn of the transatlantic slave trade, and with little knowledge of African culture, this chair is a seat of power. How do you demonstrate that power? Well, as an emerging slave trading nation, we include these subjugated Black women, shackled and at the service of other people." At the end of the sessions, it was really important that participants were sent their quotes that were to be included in the museum graphics, and asked if they were happy for their full name to have their full name alongside it, or if they would prefer to be anonymous. All text and graphics were sensitivity checked by Louisa, one of the participants who has experience in this role, before being finalised, and Louisa was paid for her time to do this. Learning outcomes. So there were quite a few. So managing expectations. The museum recognised that it was going to be a challenge to include much of the Black History Interpretations group words into the final graphics due to limitations on word counts. So this was discussed with the group from the start and throughout the session in order to manage their expectations. Sensitivities around some diverse histories. I underestimated the level of emotion that some of the topics and objects would provoke. Time was needed for participants to talk through the issues and reflect on them. This, however, further hammered home the importance of this work. A white curator could never fully understand the pain and trauma that transatlantic slavery can still have on Black people today, or relate to the lived experience of racism and prejudice. Mixing individuals from different backgrounds. Because I created a group of individuals from different backgrounds, some were academic and some more community, I had to manage the different starting points they had on the subject and their different confidence levels in airing their views. My role as chair was important to make sure that everyone had a chance to talk. Diverging opinions. The participants sometimes had diverging opinions. With one of the objects, a tobacco box where the knob on the lid was a representation of the head of a Black person. Two of the participants felt the museum should display it for educational reasons, and two participants felt the museum should not, due to it being a negative, objectified portrayal of a Black person. The museum decided not to display the object in the new Salisbury Gallery due to the negative feelings within the group. But the group were keen for the debate to be aired in another format, and one where there could be a warning before seeing the object. And this is something I'm still looking into for our online objects. Valuing the community you're working with. It's important to pay the participants for their time and expertise, and particularly important as this was emotional work. Importance of consent and agreement. As I was using personal voices and quotes within the displays, it was important to allow time to get the consent and agreement of the individuals involved. Time to incorporate community voices and decisions into designs. It is important to get the exhibition designers to allow time within the scheduling to incorporate community voices and object selection. This is slow, time-consuming work, and it can be really difficult to get the designers to work differently and allow the co-curated elements of the gallery to be finalised at a later stage. Expect some negative feedback. So we didn't get much, but we did get a couple of comments on social media. Well, one person on TripAdvisor wrote, however, beware of the usual metropolitan elite mindset and templates about slave and slave owners currently a feature in such places as this. And another person in a Google review wrote, an interesting museum, but the modish obsession with slavery distorted everything. A pity that the museum has simply rolled over on the issue. Clearly the museum's leadership is weak. I also had feedback from one unhappy volunteer who told me that the narrative on slavery made him and other white people feel uncomfortable and demanded to know why I hadn't explored white enslavement to give a more balanced view. I explained that the primary reason that this did not get explored was that I was telling a local story about slavery and anti-slavery based on the evidence that exists, and there was no evidence in the area of white enslavement. Things I'd do differently next time. I would create a community agreement. I write one with the community group that I was working to help manage their expectations. This would cover the responsibility of both the group and the museum, and ideally it would involve the group in framing the document. I'd also create a communication strategy for dealing with challenging reactions to the work. Be aware that work around controversial topics like slavery may get extensive press coverage and social media attention. And the strategy would also ensure wider staff and trustees were aware of the work and the reason that the museum is doing it. And legacy. I would spend more time thinking about the legacy to the work, how it could be woven into museum strategies, and how it can help the museum to improve and develop in the future. That is not to say there is no legacy to this project. The idea is that it will become an online resource, and also lessons learned from the project are feeding into our ongoing decolonial work. Overall, it was an incredibly positive project. The Black History Interpretation Group were very enthusiastic that the museum were undertaking this work and will include their voices in the new gallery. The group helped the museum to create more nuanced, emotive, and sensitive interpretation. And here is some feedback from the participants. And finally, this is the room of the Salisbury Gallery that all of this work fed into.
Thank you so much, Bridget. That was really, really interesting and clearly a really thoughtful and carefully conducted piece of work that hopefully is going to have kind of more wide-reaching implications as well. At this point, I'd invite people to please put their questions in the chat for Bridget so that we can share those. But I just kick off while we wait for the questions with a question of my own, which is about whether you have any plans at Salisbury Museum to continue your connections with any of the participants in that group through any expansion of their role or kind of continuing that relationship that's that started with this project.
We're not continuing the Black History Interpretation Group at present. Obviously, that was quite a specific project that fed directly into the new gallery. It also required funding so that we could pay all the participants for their time and expertise. But we are doing more decolonial projects at the museum. So we're actually starting to examine Pip Rivers' collection, the ethnographic collection that comes from around the world. So I think what this project has given us is the confidence to work with new audiences to interpret objects.
It's really interesting as well that you did encounter, differing views and if that related to something as important as whether or not to even put a piece from the collection on display, that's clearly quite, it's a really emotive area and clearly sparked a debate. So, yeah, I was wondering if any of those people were keen to continue being able to have an influence in that sense. Brilliant. We've just had, oh, sorry, I'll let you respond to that.
No, sorry, carry on.
No, it was only continuing that point really about, yeah, those links being maintained with the group. We have had some questions, so that I'd just like to ask. So David has asked if there were in terms of the negative comments you received from members of the public, as well as all the ones that you should be rightfully proud of, being taken into account, have you had positive feedback that you could reflect on or share?
Absolutely. We've had very positive feedback that about the inclusion of the Black History Interpretation Group's voices, so it comes from that personal perspective. We also have had some comments about the fact that people feel quite a balanced view has been given, because we talk about slavery, but we also talk about the local abolition story. So we have told both sides of that narrative. So absolutely, but doing reading around projects that other museums are undertaking of a similar nature, it seems to be that this work does attract some negative comments.
Yeah, and it chimed a lot with another lunchtime share that is available on the Queer in Wiltshire project, where the one of the learning parts was about having a statement pre-prepared to respond to those kind of negative feedback that could well be an inevitable process of the public interaction with challenging topics. So we've got a question from Jane. Can this work feed into the education department at all, and minority groups in the community and in the schools that you work with?
I definitely think it has the opportunity to do this. We haven't built an educational resource around it as yet. The next thing that I want to do with it is to create an online resource. I'm really aware that not much of the final material was able to make it into the galleries because of the tight word count from the designers. So I'd really like to have a kind of online presence of this work, so that people can read more of the narratives that were had and the discussions. And I absolutely think it could become a secondary school session based around this at a later date.
And you mentioned the designers and obviously the quite strict sort of limitations that some of the design process can bring. If you were going forwards with this approach again, do you think there would be value in the designers themselves, or the designer being involved in the discussions that were actually going on in terms of understanding the participants' points of view, and how and the importance of what you wanted to contain within the interpretation that ultimately goes on the wall?
Oh, that's a difficult question. Possibly. I think the most important thing was to talk to the designers at a very, very early stage about the way the co-curation was going to filter into the exhibition design, and to make sure they had the understanding of the importance of the work, and the fact it needs a slightly different approach to allow for it to work successfully. The main thing is that it's a slow process to work with the community. And I was constantly feeling like the designers wanted to know the final objects selection and the final text much sooner than I was really ready to give it to them. But they were very understanding, and we did talk to them a lot at the beginning about elements of the gallery that were going to have to be approached in a different way, and really put to the end of the design process and get on with everything else that was a bit more simpler. But yes, possibly if they'd sat in on some of them, but I don't know if they'd have had the time to do that.
No, obviously time and capacity resources are always a factor, but I had another question about when the decision was made to not place a particular item on display from the collection in the new gallery. Is it stored in the collection with reference to that decision being taken? I was wondering if, as time goes by, for example, in another 50 years' time, is that object likely to be reinterpreted in a different way, for example? And I wondered if that could become part of its journey, even if it's in storage.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, actually. And I think these discussions that we've had around very specific objects absolutely could become part of that object history that we keep at the museum. Because the group also made another really important decision that fed into the new gallery, which was which of the two mayoral chairs to display. So they chose the earlier of the two chairs because they felt the representation of the women on the back of the chairs was stronger. So they also made a really important decision there. So I think absolutely that those decisions should be we should find some way to tie it to the objects and the way they're catalogued and stored here at the museum.
Yeah, and hopefully that's becoming a question that's being asked across the decolonisation work that's happening more broadly in the sector, which feels like it's certainly gathering momentum. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask Bridget at this point? Please pop your queries in the chat, and I will make sure that I can share those. For the end of the session, we will be sharing a link to just a short feedback survey for you as a result of this session, and that's just gone live in the chat. Thank you, Kate. So please do take the time for that. Your feedback's really valuable. Okay, I have got another question while we wait to see if anyone else would like to ask anything for you, Bridget. I wondered if you have plans to continue a similar approach to other items or whole areas within the collection. You mentioned the Pitt Rivers connection there. I just wondered if there's been wider conversations in the museum about taking this forwards.
Well, mainly really about using people with different perspectives to interpret objects. So I mentioned the Pitt Rivers project that we're embarking on. So we're looking at ethnographic objects from different parts of the world, and we'd really like to reach out to the countries of origin to help to interpret those objects. Again, we're at the very early stages of that project, so we need to understand a little bit more about the objects before we do that reaching out. But I think this project has really shown us the value and worth of working with different audiences and people with a different understanding and a better understanding than we have already at the museum.
Thank you. I have a question from Lucy, which was, was there volunteer training around the objects that were put on display in the gallery and the interpretation for when the new gallery opened?
There was quite a lot of volunteer training around the new galleries and the stories that are being told. So that was led by Kate, our volunteer coordinator. And we're still doing work around that. So we're producing fact sheets around some of the objects. And obviously it'd be good for some of these objects that came up in this session to be part of that, so the volunteers understand the process that has gone on behind it.
And I wonder, this may not be a question you're able to answer, it's more of an open thought really, that whether volunteers have to face any of the negative feedback when they're actually in the gallery, how they can kind of cope with that situation should it arise, because I can imagine that that can be quite challenging to encounter.
Yeah, I haven't had any feedback around negativity within the gallery itself. And as I said, those two comments are kind of just two comments within a lot of very positive comments about the work that we've done at the museum. But as you said, it's an important thing to give the volunteers the tools to deal with situations should they come up. So I think that's probably something we still need to address.
I think everyone's always suspicious if there's only positive comments in terms of sort of the balance, as it were. There's always going to be some potentially negative feedback in the mix there. So I think that's a true reflection of any project or program that approaches difficult topics, but all the more reason to do it, hopefully. Well, there aren't any further questions in the chat at the moment. So I'd like to thank you very much, Bridget, for sharing today. It's been a really insightful session. It definitely inspired me to go and look at the new gallery again at Salisbury. So thank you very much. And thank you to the audience who joined us today and could spend their lunch hour on some interesting and informative new things. So please look out for this lunchtime share when it goes live online, and do share with your colleagues, and just take a couple of minutes to do our feedback form. We'd be really grateful. So I'll draw this session to a close, and thank you very much, everyone.